Since it does have a microphone, you can speak into it. You'll state your full name and spell your last name.
Mark Ball, B-A-L-L.
Mr. Ball, will you tell the jury a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What do you do?
I'm a lawyer in Hampton. I practice with the Parker Law Group now. I've lived in Hampton for 20-plus years. I now live in Rum Gully here in Colleton County. Have for about 8 years, 9 years. I practice mostly
How
civil
long
law.
have you been a lawyer?
33 years.
Okay. And where were you born and raised?
In Ballantyne, South Carolina, up above Columbia, about 20 miles.
And when did you move down to this part of the state?
I started with the law firm 34 years ago. I moved down. I was a law clerk at first and have never left since 1988.
Do you know the defendant, Alec Murdaugh?
I do.
How long have you known him?
34 years.
And did you practice law together?
We did, about 20-something.
Did you become personal friends of his?
Yes. I mean,
And were your family friends with his family?
yes. Our children grew up together, as did everybody in the firm.
And your wife, Lisa, would she become good friends with Maggie?
Yes, sir.
Okay. On the, you remember the evening of June the 7th,
I do very well.
2021?
Yes, sir.
How did you learn about the tragic murders of Maggie and Paul?
It was about 10:30, and one of my partners, Ronnie Crosby, tried to call my phone, and before I could get to it, he called my wife's phone, and he said, "Give me, hand mark the phone," and he said Maggie and Paul had been shot and get over there. And so I scrambled and got over there. I live about 8 or 10 miles from there. I live over in Rum Gully, and that's Moselle.
And why did you go over there?
To find out what was going on, to see what I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and somebody calls you and says your law partner's wife and child have been shot. You go. I mean,
And who did you go with?
I went with my wife Lisa.
And when you got there, who was on the scene? Do you recall?
Yeah, I came in by the cabin, what's referred to as the cabin side of it, and there was a ambulance was pulled up next to what I would call the hangar building. It was pulled up there, and then Barry McRoy's vehicle, he drives a SUV of some type, and then there was a police car pulled off to the right-hand side, probably 50 yards before you get to them, and I pulled in right behind them on the left-hand or the right-hand side of the driveway coming in, and then walked over.
Will you remind the jury who Barry McCoy is?
Barry McRoy is the chief of the fire and rescue here in Colleton County.
So when you arrived, I think so Barry McCoy was present?
He was there. He was standing there speaking with a deputy, and there were 2 EMT paramedics standing over near their ambulance.
And when you pulled into the lower driveway by the cabin, had any roadblocks or barriers been put up to stop cars from coming in there?
None. I got there about 10:50, 10:52, something like that.
Did you have a conversation with any law enforcement officers about the need to block the entrance?
I did eventually. I was talking to Barry about, I had found out just before I got there, somebody had called me, and they work with sort of the maintenance side of fire and rescue, and they had come across the radio that there were 2 dead. So I suspected that Paul and Maggie had passed away. So when I got there, I was talking to Barry and asking him some questions. I could see Randy kind of through the alleyway between the dog kennel and the sort of wing shed that comes off of the hangar, and then Buddy Hill, the sheriff, came over, and then I spoke with him.
And did you talk about the need to block the entrance into the Moselle property off Moselle Road?
We did just briefly. He said, I need to get this blocked off, and I think he took a phone call or something, and I walked back to tell my wife what was going on, and I saw another deputy coming in, so I walked out to the head of the road there, and I said, I think the sheriff wants this blocked off. And then I walked back to where Barry McRoy was. And then
Did that entrance get blocked off?
No.
What happened?
People just kept piling in. It was just more and more people kept showing up.
Roughly how many cars do you think piled in?
I don't know, because shortly thereafter I walked around to the other side, but there were a good many. When I walked back over there an hour and a half later, there were a good many cars over there.
And when you say you walked around the other side, I don't think we need a diagram, but just tell the jury what you're talking about.
Well, there's a dog pen. From where I was standing, the dog pen would be to the left. The aircraft hangar with two wing sheds coming off of it would be directly in front of me. There's a skinning shed that would be to the far right, and then directly across from the hangar shed, probably 50 or 60, 75 yards, would be another storage shed, equipment shed. And so I walked down almost to where the skinning shed was, and then back around in front of the far shed, the equipment shed.
So you did not walk directly between the shed and the kennels?
No, sir.
You walked around the shed?
Correct.
Before you walked around the shed, did you stand and observe what was happening within the taped off area?
I did. People were walking between the dog pen, and the law enforcement and responders had walked between the two areas, the wing shed and the dog kennel, and I could see where Paul was, but he was covered up. Barry had covered him up.
And what was the weather?
It was misty. It wasn't really raining, but it was one of those kind of foggy days or nights that it's more than just a fog. You get wet, and eventually it got where it would drizzle off and on, and later on it didn't rain hard, but it would intermittently sprinkle in that kind of floating heavy fog.
Did you make any observations about water coming off the roof of the kennel?
I did later on when I got around to that side.
Okay, what observations did you make?
Eventually the water was running off. That dog kennel is built with a small cantilever on the front of it, and then a longer part off the back, and water was dripping off of the front of the shed where Paul was.
Was water landing on Paul?
It was.
And could you see where the water would then accumulate after it landed on Paul?
It would drain off. There's a cement apron right there in the front of that feed room, and there was water there. There was water in the gravel to some degree. The grass was wet. It wasn't raining so hard that you couldn't just stand there without an umbrella, but it was drizzling enough that you were getting wet.
And the fact that you observed water dripping off the roof onto Paul's body, did that concern you?
It did. It did.
Why?
Well, one, I didn't think that, it's a crime scene. You don't want just water dripping all over the place, but more importantly, I thought it was pretty disrespectful. Paul was a good young man, and I, quite frankly, it just pissed me off.
I understand. Did you have a conversation with anyone about trying to prevent that?
I don't think I did about that aspect of it, but I just thought that they should have put a tarp or something. Just out of respect.
Right.
They eventually did with Maggie put up what I would call a tailgating tent, very similar to the media tents that are out front, those little lightweight, and they put that over Maggie.
Right.
To my knowledge, they never did over Paul, at least while I was there.
When you walked around the shed to get on the other side, who was on the other side?
Well, I could see through the alleyway between the dog kennels and that wing shed coming off of. If you were standing in front of the aircraft hangar, it'd be the right-hand side where Maggie was. I could see Randy over there and Alec. Alec much more infrequently, but Randy was on the phone walking, and I could see him. And I think he and I got there about the same time. He had come through the main gate.
When you got up, what did you get up to greet Alec?
I did. When I walked around, Alec met me about halfway where that equipment shed is. Alec came, as soon as he saw me coming up through there, he met me about halfway in front of that shed and just went to pieces. He's Alec's 6'4", 6'5", whatever he is, and I'm 5'9". He pretty well smothers you when he hugs you. And
What was his demeanor?
He was devastated. I mean, he was crying. He was, I mean, just beside himself. And I told him we'd get through it. And he go ahead.
Yeah. Eventually, did SLED arrived on the scene?
He did, but while Alec was
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
kind of, I'm trying to console him and patting him on the back, and he said, "Look at what they did. Look at what they did to them." I mean, just right off the bat.
So during that initial encounter with Alec, he referred to they, look what they did. Is that correct?
Yeah, they, which I didn't really think about at the time until I was taking my wife home. I just thought it was an odd comment.
The SLED arrived sometime later.
They did.
Do you remember about how long after your initial arrival SLED got on the scene?
I think they came kind of in, because I'm sure they were coming from various locations, but they were there probably within an hour and a half of me being there.
And by the time SLED arrived, were there other members from your law firm and family members out on the property where you were standing?
There were. By the time SLED got there, pretty much all the lawyers in the firm, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3, one of them had small children, and one got forgotten, and pretty much everybody that was a lawyer was there. And family members, all of Alec's family was there.
Were you directed to leave the area when SLED started processing the crime scene?
Eventually we were. The coroner came over, Rich Harvey, came over and said SLED was there. They were ready to start processing the scene. He said, "Y'all need to, go over to the house," and I said, "Are you sure about that?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Are you sure it's okay for us to go to the house?" And he walked back over and asked somebody and came back and said, "Yeah." And I said,
"Did you have any concerns going to the house?"
I did.
What were your concerns?
Well, it's twofold. One, this is a pretty big farm, and I don't know who's over there. 2 people have been gunned down, and is it safe? So safety is one concern, and the other is that part of what went on here? And so where's the crime scene start and stop?
And when you got to the house, did it appear that the house had been searched and cleared in any form or fashion?
I didn't see any signs of that, but I'm not a criminologist. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not a defense lawyer, but it looked like just a regular house.
Okay. But before you go to the house, did you have any conversations with law enforcement about your knowledge of Paul receiving threats?
Yeah, I had asked, when I was standing where I had driven up, Buddy Hill had come over there, and he asked me if I knew, because I know Sheriff Hill, and he asked if I had any idea of who might want to do this, and I said, not really. And he said, do you know of any threats? And I said, I know Paul had gotten, since the boat wreck, that he had gotten several, threats and just people cranking off from all over the place, not necessarily local, but from everywhere. And I would hear it from, Alec from time to time, and different stuff. And so I told him that.
Did when you had that conversation with Sheriff Hill, had you spoken to Alec?
I had not at that point. I hadn't gotten over to him.
When you had that conversation with Sheriff Hill, had you listened to the 911 call?
No, sir.
That thought of threats, was that an independent thought of yours?
Well, it was response to a question,
right,
from Sheriff Hill.
And your thought process was about the boating accident?
Well, that was the only threat that I knew of that Paul had ever encountered.
Right. When do you remember who went to the house when you went into the Moselle residence?
Yeah.
Who was with you?
Well, I mean, I probably can't name them all. I'll probably leave somebody off, but it was myself, Ronnie Crosby, Lee Cope, Austin Crosby, Neil, Alger, Randy Murdaugh, Alec.
Had Buster gotten there yet?
Buster had gotten there, I believe, but I'm not sure. He and Brooklyn, I remember when they came up, but I can't tell you whether it was over before we left over there. It seems to me that they drove up at the house, but I can't tell you for certain. And then there was Corey Fleming and Chris Wilson showed up, Lynn, John Marvin, just a host of people. Greg Alexander, chief of police in Yemassee, who's a friend of theirs, showed up. There were
a lot of people in the house.
a lot of people.
What did you observe of the condition of the house?
When we came in the door, we obviously went to the den, and we're standing around. The den and the kitchen in that house are connected, and there were pots on the stove, so Lee Cope and myself and I think Austin got the pots. I think I set something in the sink, and they stuck some in the refrigerator.
But when you entered the house, it looked like there was food out that had been prepared for dinner?
There was food on the stove, yeah.
Okay.
I don't recall seeing any plates, but somebody else could have picked them up. I wouldn't.
But were folks cleaning up?
Sure.
And what time of day was this?
It was probably 1:30 or 2 in the morning.
Do you remember what time you left the Moselle residence on that night, early morning?
I probably left at 3:30 or 4. I left when Alec was leaving.
When did you go back to the property?
I had a deposition the next morning, and I ended up having to take it, and then I got out there about 11, I guess.
And was Alec there when you got there?
I went over to the dog pen over that way. I had gotten a call that morning about 8 o'clock from Randy, 8 or 8:15, and John had gone over there trying to clean up and couldn't do it. I mean, emotionally, and
Right.
Randy had asked me if I could see about finding somebody to come clean it up, or did I know anybody. And I called the coroner's office to find out if they had people that did that type of work or knew of people that did that type of work. And ultimately the coroner called me back and gave me the names of 2 companies, and
Okay.
I gave those to Lee, and he started trying to run them down.
Okay. I inadvertently skipped over something on my outline. When you were at the house before you left, so you left about 3:30 in the morning or so, were you there when SLED agents came up and took custody of Alec's clothes that he was wearing?
I was. They knocked on the door. Somebody answered the door. For some reason, I got up and walked over there, and they said they needed his clothes and to, I think, swab his hands. I walked back over. Alec had been sitting next to me on the couch. There's 2 couches in the den that sort of face each other, and then 2 chairs that are headed towards the kitchen. He was sitting on the far couch, and I walked back over and I said, Alec, they need your clothes. Can you step back here with these folks? And it was a male and a female.
Okay. Well, before we go any further, let me ask you, were your clothes wet or dry when you were sitting on the couch?
They were pretty wet. They weren't soaked, but they were uncomfortably damp.
And do you recall whether Alec's clothes were damp as well?
I would assume they are. I didn't reach over
And did you see how the clothes were, I guess, collected? Were they put on a hanger, wrapped up carefully, or what happened?
The male went into what Alec's bedroom, at least I'm assuming that's Alec's bedroom, and he came back out, and then I saw Alec just kind of, the female agent or officer was holding the bag, and Alec dropped him in.
Okay. There was one bag, multiple bags?
I thought it was one, but I couldn't tell you whether it was 1 or 2 or 3.
All right. Went down, now I'm jumping back to where we were on the morning of June the 8th. After you got out of your deposition, did you go to the property?
I did.
And you went down to the kennels?
I did. I drove over there.
Had the crime scene been released?
It had been released, and because I asked Randy that morning, he said, yeah, they've released it when John was down there.
And what'd you do?
Well, I just wandered around. There was a sled agent there. I think at some point Duffy Stone and Sean, his deputy, Thornton, was there, and I think one of their investigators, they were over inside the hangar, and there was a sled agent. At least I'm presuming he was a sled agent, and I don't know who he was. It wasn't any of the ones that were working the case that I came to find out that were working the case later on that I can remember. And I looked around at different things.
Did you look in the feed room?
I did.
What did you see in the feed room?
Well, by that time, I think Ronnie had either come up or was over there.
Ronnie
Crosby.
Your law partner.
And I think Lee Cope was there as well, but I'm not sure about that. I'm pretty sure. And I was looking in the feed room, and you could see, obviously there was still a pretty raw scene. And there were
there still remains of Paul in the feed room that had not been collected?
At first, I didn't see it. I saw shot, on the floor, steel shot on the floor, number 2. Steel
shot. You mean pellets from a...
Yeah, like bird shot, except it was number 2, steel.
Okay, and you saw that in the feed room?
It was all over everything. It was on the floor. It was on the shelves. It was various places.
Okay.
And then I got to looking around, and there was you could see where a piece of buckshot had gone through, and you could see where it had knocked out, or shot through twice where the window was, or is. 2 had gone through that. There was some plastic crates or something, and you could see where one of the shot had gone through and had embedded in the window frame right there, the molding. And then there was a piece of buckshot laying on the ledge of the windowsill.
What did you do when you observed the shots?
I walked back out and asked what I thought was the agent. And
what was the agent?
He said, we've got all we need. And so I walked back over there and looked around, and then looking around around the floor and all that, there was a piece of Paul's skull about the size of a baseball laying there.
Did that upset you?
It did, very much. I mean, it just really infuriated me. And I don't know who I was supposed to be mad at, but it just infuriated me that this young man had been murdered, and there were still his remains there. And there was a large blood spot and tissue out right off of the apron of that area right outside the feed room that was there. And kind of like walking across a grave. It's one of those things you just don't do.
Right. After you spent time down at the kennel area, what'd you do next?
I ended up going back to the house, and I remember Terry Brandstetter, Maggie's daddy, was there, and several other people, and I spoke to them and went in the house, and eventually went towards where the gun room was that afternoon.
Did SLED agents come up to search the house while you were present?
They did. They
And I think the jury's seen a video of it. We don't need to play it, but were you present in the gun room?
I was. I think they probably 2:30 or 3 o'clock, something like that. They showed up, and I had a discussion with that same agent, and I'm assuming it's a SLED agent. It could have been a sheriff's deputy, but I made the assumption that it was a SLED agent over at the kennels and the hangar. I asked if they'd figured out what kind of gun it was, and at that time I didn't know. I assumed it was a .223 based on the night before. Barry McRoy had said that he thought it was some type of assault rifle, and I just immediately kind of went there, and that agent had said that it was a three something, and I said a 300 blackout, and he said yeah, and I said, well, there's one over there in the gun rack, and he said no, there's not, and apparently SLED had been there sometime that morning or whatever. He said they already checked, there's not one over there, and I said yes, there is, and so later on when they got there, there was one there.
So, and you located it for SLED?
Yeah.
The night, early morning hours, 2 or 3 o'clock before you left, had you seen the gun room?
I had.
Were there guns on the pool table and whatnot?
I walked in there. The door was shut. I think the door was shut between it and there's sort of a transition hall. You go through there, and then there was a bathroom, and then where the freezers were, and then it exits out onto the porch. And then straight ahead would be, I guess in the original house plans, would have been a garage, but it was kind of a den game room that Alec had turned into a recreation/gun room, and a large room. And I walked in there, and there were 3 shotguns on the table, pool table,
Right.
and some other stuff, some shells and stuff.
And when you went back the next day, the 8th, in daylight hours, early afternoon, it looked like things had been put up.
They had been put up. There were no guns on the table. There were no shells, no nothing there. And so I asked what happened to that. And I was told that the maid had put them up. And so I went and asked her.
Was it Blanca?
And yeah, I went to Blanca, and she said, yeah, I was told to clean up the room. And so I put them up and put them in the rack.
Okay. And did you point out to the SLED agents the guns that were on the table that you thought you'd seen the night before?
I didn't point out the guns. I told them that there had been guns there.
When you're on the property on the, I guess the morning on the 8th at some point in time, did you observe an employee that had been working on the property for Alec, individual by the name of C.B. Rowe?
I did.
And did you take pictures of his vehicle for some reason?
I took pictures of a vehicle. I didn't know whose vehicle it was. There was a vehicle that had pulled up underneath of again, if you were standing in front of the hangar where the big door is, it would have been to the right. And there was a truck that had pulled up in there, and it didn't have a license tag on it. And when I walked by it, there was a jug of Clorox, and I can't remember what else was in there, but it was a jug of Clorox, and I just thought that was odd.
Where was the Clorox?
It was in the bed of the truck.
Okay.
And I took a couple of pictures of it and turned them over to SLED.
And why did you take pictures?
It just looked odd. two people had gotten killed, and there's Clorox around.
Okay. There's been I won't make a statement. Did you see any coolers on the property down there?
I did.
Where did you see a cooler?
When I walked around the bottom part between the skin and shed and the hangar and the other shed, there was a open cooler there, or looked like a Yeti style cooler, and I can't tell you whether it was a Yeti or not, but it was one of those thicker coolers, and there was probably a dozen beer cans around it that night, and the next day when I walked by it was still there.
Okay.
I just thought with all the people and the hoopla that had gone on, that it didn't look very good.
Okay. Did you? Was that the only thing that stood out about the cooler? The beer cans around?
The beer cans, yeah. Looked like somebody had unloaded a boat or something,
right,
and just kind of thrown them out of the boat and forgot about them and left it.
Did what kind of law do you practice?
Civil.
Okay. Plaintiffs, defense?
Mostly plaintiffs. Occasionally I'll defend a small business or a farmer or something like that, but
right,
for the most part it's all
during
plaintiffs.
The course of your practice, have you had experience with getting cell phone records of parties to find out information?
I have. It's pretty regular now. I mean, just about every defense lawyer asks, and every plaintiff's lawyer asks, because so many people are texting and talking on the phone when they rear end somebody or crash into somebody or whatever, and you want to know if you ask them, were you on the phone, and they say no, and it shows up on the bill, then they probably were on the phone.
And as part of your, I guess, concern about Maggie and Paul and Alec, did you pull his cell phone records?
Well, I was asked to pull them, and yeah, we provided them to both SLED and to your office, I believe,
right,
for Alec's cell phone records.
And if you're trying to get information from an opposing party or something about cell phone records, are the records more reliable than the actual handheld phone device?
Objection, Your Honor.
In your experience?
401, 402.
Did you hear the objection?
I
Since the lawyer, then you don't respond until the court rules. Response to the objection.
There's been testimony about deleted call logs, Your Honor, and this addresses that issue.
Anything further? Objection's overruled.
I don't know that aspect of it. That's a technical. I get the records because they're more accessible than getting a download and going through the. There are cases that you may want to get a download, but the run-of-the-mill cases, with truck wrecks and stuff, the records of the cell phone call records tend to answer the question that I'm asking.
You've known Alec for 30 plus years?
Yes, sir.
You recognize his voice?
Yes, sir.
And I think at one point in time were you asked to identify his voice on a video of down at the kennel?
Yes, sir.
And did you do so?
Yes, sir.
And you determined it was Alec's voice?
Alec and Maggie and Paul.
And you told that to SLED?
Yes, sir.
Have you listened to a tape that's been played in this courtroom about whether Alec said, I did them so bad or they did them so bad?
Objection. 401, 402, and beyond the scope of this witness's knowledge.
Objection overruled.
I was sent a snippet and asked the question
Okay.
what it was, and
Hang on, I'm not getting your response. So let's, Your Honor, we'd like to play the snippet from State's Exhibit 153 for this witness.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And Your Honor, I would object. I believe that this witness was not present for this conversation, and again, would object under 401 and 402 in relevance to his commentary on that particular exhibit.
Objection's overruled.
And sitting there talking to me is tough.
It's just so bad. It's so bad.
Sounds like they to me.
Right.
I played the snippet multiple times, and
And is it consistent with what he told you the night of the murders?
it is.
You remember in, I think February 2019, that Paul Murdaugh was involved in a boating accident,
I do.
and you're aware that he was criminally charged,
I am.
and then Alec and I believe Buster were civilly sued.
Yes, sir.
And did you work on the case formally?
Not formally, no. I was about to get in after the murders, along with several other partners.
Did leading up to the murders, did you have conversations with Alec about civil case and the criminal case?
I did about the civil case to begin with, and then when the charges came out, I talked with Deanne Randolph.
What was Alec's, if you know, what he expressed to you his priority between the two matters was?
Well, obviously the criminal matter was much more pressing for him.
And in your conversations with him, did you gain an understanding of his concern about the civil case?
Yeah, somewhat.
And
But it,
how concerning was the civil case?
well, I mean, obviously, anytime you get sued, you've got to be concerned about it. And, you know, it was the whole boating accident as a whole was very negative towards him, towards Paul, and the entire family, or his entire family. And so, you know, it was obviously it wasn't a nothing, but at the same time, I read the complaint. Several partners and my lawyers in my firm read the complaint, and at the time that he was sued, the causes of action against Alec were drafted probably to try to get as much insurance coverage as they could, which is what you do as a plaintiff's lawyer. You're looking for coverage. You don't want to make allegations that get you out of coverage, and it was very vanilla against him. And the allegations against Alec were that I sort of referred to him, and others did as well, as sort of bad parenting. You had a adult child that the allegation was that you allowed him to go out and drink, and when you're 18, you pretty much get to do what you want, and you've reached your majority. And so I thought it was very defensible as to those causes of action at that time, or that cause of action.
Sure.
And I think he did too, but I don't know what he thought.
Right. Did it, some point in time, Alec, was he forced to resign from the firm?
He was. September the 3rd.
What day was it?
September the 3rd.
And after that, did you have an opportunity to look in his office?
I did. He resigned on the 3rd. Then there was the incident on the 4th. And I left the scene over there on Old Salkehatchie and went by the office. And I'd also been in his office on Friday after he resigned.
When you were in his office, did you find any paperwork that looked like he had been working on for the boating case?
Not until the 5th.
Okay, and what paperwork did you find on the 5th?
The 5th, I went in and started really, because we have an obligation to those clients that he was representing, and I didn't want files just laying around. This was Labor Day weekend. All this hoopla and emotion of, the murders, the issues with Alec leaving the firm, and then that Saturday. And so that Sunday I went in to the office and went to his office and started going through to make sure that any client files were put over in stack, over there. And as I was going through, I found checks that he had deposited with his telephone that were some of the funds that sort of started all this mess with the Ferris case. They were laying, one was on his top of his desk, one was in a drawer. I pulled out one of the drawers, and there was a tablet, a legal tablet, that had numbers written down on it as far as debts and assets, and just kind of the scribblings of kind of what you owe and what you've got.
Would it be something that you would normally see on a net worth statement?
It would be the same information. When I think of a net worth statement, I think of the form that a bank sends you.
Right.
But yeah, it obviously, he was listing what he had and what he owed.
Is it something, the type of format you've seen in civil litigation where a defendant's required to produce net worth?
Not in the same form, but the same information.
I skipped another topic. After Maggie and Paul's death, did you collect her jewelry?
I did. I got a call on the Wednesday, I believe, after the murders on Monday, from the coroner. His wife and my wife had worked as surgical nurses at Hampton Hospital together, and then my wife ended up being the supervisor over that area, and so I knew them very well, and I'd known Rich for 30 years. He called and said that Lori had cleaned up the jewelry, and whenever Alec wanted it, and I said, well, I'll come get it. And so I met him, Ronnie Crosby, and I came over to his office and picked it up, signed for it, and I carried it back to the house. And
within the jewelry, do you remember the wedding ring and wedding bands and other jewelry?
There were rings. I can't tell you. There was the thing that sticks out to me was she had a diamond bracelet on, and it was in pieces. And he said he tried to find all the pieces, but there was still some missing.
Okay.
But I wasn't paying attention so much to. It just didn't feel right looking and snooping around in somebody else's stuff.
Knowing Alec for 30 years, do you develop an assessment of his relationship with his family, Maggie, Paul, and Buster?
Well, I will tell you this. The person I thought I knew loved his family, or appeared to love his family very much. He'd take their calls. He'd do all of those things. After, September the 3rd, I'm not sure I know that person. And so, but he always seemed to be devoted to everything. Their ball games, he would aggravate the hell out of me when you'd be in a deposition and they would call and he'd answer it, and you'd be in a meeting or whatever, and he always took their calls, whereas my wife and my children never called me unless it was a true emergency. And Alec took their calls whether it was they needed a gallon of milk, or they had something important to tell him. I mean, he always took their calls.
And did you see them together frequently?
I did. They went places. You'd see pictures of them. I think Maggie was a pretty prolific Facebook, text, whatever. I'm not on any social media, but my daughter or my wife would show me pictures of where they had been, or ball games, different things like that. I never saw anything that indicated to me that there was anything out of the way with any of the relationships, including the drug stuff. I had no,
Yeah, let me ask you, were you aware that he had opioid addiction?
none.
And were any of the partners aware that he had opioid?
None to my knowledge. I mean, that was not a subject matter that ever came up. I mean, it was, and you know, Paul, I think, has been sort of demonized by this whole affair, and it's just not fair. I mean, Paul, it's like a lot of young people I know, you know, they kind of are trying to find where the fence is. Sometimes they get, you know, going a little fast and, you know, blow through some things, but Paul was a good kid. He was always polite to me. I never had one single solitary issue with him at all. And I knew he had done some things, you know, that most kids, you know, are mischievous do. And on at least one occasion I went to Alec and told him that I thought Paul needed to be throttled back a little bit, that I saw some videos of him driving fast. And I don't know what Alec did, but that was, our firm was very much of a family. I mean, if you were a member of our firm, and it didn't matter whether you were a lawyer or one of our folks. I mean, our staff is family as well, and if they have a problem, we all have a problem. And so we look out for each other, and we did. Unfortunately, Alec betrayed that when he stole the money. Sure. But you know, the outward things that I saw of Alec with his kids and his wife were just that. I mean, they were what I observed. Nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors, but they seemed to enjoy each other's company.
All right. Court's indulged.